Hey, everybody, and welcome back to the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm your host, Josh Zorhoff, and I'm a teaching pastor and a therapist in the West Michigan area. And this podcast is brought to you by the Fearless family of churches and my good friends at Care Portal. Care Portal is a technology platform that helps families in need connect with local agencies and local churches to keep children out of the foster care system and with their forever families. And we're so excited for what Care Portal is doing and how they are connecting with the Chaplaincy on the Go podcast. I'm really stoked for this conversation because joining me today in this conversation is my good friend Dave McGovern, who's been on the podcast before. Dave is a therapist and he is in the West Michigan area. And we're going to talk a little bit about marriage. We're going to spend the next 8 episodes or so talking about how important marriage is and how we can make our marriages thrive. And so, Dave, I'm stoked to have you here.
I'm super excited to be back and excited to be able to dive in with you and talk through what it looks like to build and have a thriving marriage. And I think everyone listening who's been married either a year or maybe 25 years and beyond, there's always room to be able to do maintenance and think about who we are and where we're going as a married couple.
Absolutely. So, Dave, what are we going to be talking about in these episodes? Specifically, what are we talking about today?
Today, we're going to be diving into what I think is a vital foundation for any marriage, and that's communication, Josh. And I meet with couples every week. I'm a marriage therapist, as you said. And no matter what context or problem people are bringing in, Josh, communication needs to be foundational.
Yeah, I totally agree. As I've done marriage counseling over the years as well, there are 2 primary problems in relationships that I see over and over and over, and they are completely linked. One is communication, which we're going to talk about, and the other is conflict resolution, which will be on a separate episode as well. And I say that those things are 2 sides of the same coin. If you don't have good communication, you're not going to have good conflict resolution. And if you're struggling to resolve your conflict, it's probably because somewhere along the line, your communication is getting hijacked.
Yes, absolutely. So do you want to dive in?
I totally do. I want to dive right into communication and talk about what the killers of communication are.
Yes, there are 4 communication killers, and they're universal to any human that I've met that is married. And they are as follows: criticism, where you're overly critical of your spouse. If you say you never, or sort of point your finger at them as you're talking or trying to resolve something. Becoming overly defensive, defensiveness. And it's a natural human response, Josh. If I were to critique you, you would naturally become defensive.
Yeah, I would want to, for sure.
Yes. The third is contempt. That's what I describe this as: the meaner older brother or sister of criticism. It comes with scoffing, an eye roll. There's a meanness in your tone, sometimes in even the words you're using. Contempt can also be bringing something up from the past that has nothing to do with what you're talking about currently. But you think it's a good idea just to bring your spouse down just a notch. And then lastly, the 4th one is stonewalling. And you can emotionally stonewall, like you're there in the room, but you're emotionally blocked off. You're like, okay, go ahead, say what you need to say. Are you happy now? Yep, go ahead, say that. Or you can physically stonewall where you are like, peace out, I'm going to the other room, I'm done talking to you.
Yeah, we had an episode like that in my marriage a few days ago. Christy and I got into a fight. She said something that made me feel triggered, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But it was a criticism. That's how I took it. I immediately went to defensiveness. And then I started harboring frustration toward her and thinking about things that she said in the past that have made me feel that way. And I brought them up, which is a really bad idea in the moment. And then finally, we went to this place where we weren't really talking to each other. And then one of us had to like break the ice by saying, hey, so are we going to talk about this? Or are you just going to like walk away and like do the dishes? Like what's going to happen here? And I think what's really important for people listening is that these communication killers are present and can be present at almost all times of the marriage, and they are killers to the way that we communicate. And so why, Dave, does that break down the way that it does?
Yeah. So here's what's happening. When one or all 4, and when I share those with couples, I just get a silent nod like, yep, that one, or yep, last night, or we use all of those every day. right? And here's what's happening. When one of those is introduced, without you knowing it, you are immediately being put into what I refer to as downstairs brain. Okay, it's a stress response, your limbic system. Some people know it as fight or flight. You've done some great work on this podcast on stress. And when we are communicating out of a stress response, we're reacting rather than reflecting or thinking, which we'll get to in a second. And your brain is actually concerned with trying to find subconsciously safety. And one easy way to do that is to either be right or win. And so you're not actually on a path to hearing, understanding your spouse, finding resolution. Your heart rate goes up a little bit, your tone goes up a little bit, and all of a sudden, you're like really angry or frustrated and bringing up other stuff that has nothing to do with the conversation because you're in a fight or flight response. And that's why it kills the communication, because those 4 things send you into that system, whether you know it or not.
And when you're in that system, you don't have capacity for clear thinking. You don't have capacity for kindness or empathy the same way, curiosity, compassion, essentially all the things that we would want in a healthy conversation. Those cannot be accessed to the same degree. And I know that we've talked about it on the podcast before, but just for people listening in, when you go to that downstairs brain, it takes less than 3 seconds for blood flow to move from the prefrontal cortex to the limbic system, from the upstairs brain to the downstairs brain. And in that 3 seconds, you lose your capacity for that healthy communication. And it takes over 90 seconds, sometimes more, 30 to 90 times longer to reroute blood flow through deep breathing or meditation or other techniques to bring that blood flow back. And so it's just so important when those communication killers hit, communication goes out the window.
Yeah. And you described the upstairs brain perfectly. And that's where we want to live, work, and play with our spouses, right? Curiosity, kindness, empathy. All things that I know I want to receive from my wife, Megan. And if she was here, I'm sure she'd say, yeah, that sounds pretty good. And so we just have to be aware of that. And I explain it to couples all the time through, it's kind of a silly story, but I think it helps paint a picture of that. Is let's say you are planning a nice quality time with your spouse, and you've had a long work week, and you guys are going to watch a new show on Netflix that you guys heard about. And one of you decides, I'm going to make popcorn for our quality time.
Love that.
And the kicker is, Josh, is that since the moment you met your spouse, one of you has made it abundantly clear that you hate butter on the popcorn. It triggers you. It's just not a helpful space for you. And you've said this for years. And
you had a bad experience
whatever
as
it might
a child.
Be. Sure.
With butter.
Yes. And so one of the spouses, very excited to have quality time with their spouse, comes up with a giant bowl of popcorn, but it's doused in butter. And the other spouse sees it and immediately looks at the spouse and says, "Do you ever even listen to me?" And then that spouse is like, "Well, hold on a second. I think I listened yesterday," and starts to become defensive.
Yep.
And then all of a sudden, what was supposed to be a nice evening, what was supposed to be shared popcorn, now there's a 45-minute discussion on whether someone listens or not. And in that moment, what we see here is someone introducing criticism, someone becoming defensive. But the key is the spouse that saw the butter, they said, "Do you ever even listen?" And so what starts out as a conversation about popcorn, a thing, which we have lots of different things each day, that person is actually feeling or trying to communicate, "I sometimes don't feel heard by you. I sometimes feel second." And it's just popcorn, but that's some of the real emotion, some of the real feelings that are being brought up by just seeing butter on the popcorn.
And you talk about this in couple counseling when you're working with individuals who are struggling with the communication, that there is a thing, which is the popcorn. And then there's a thing behind the thing, which is I don't feel heard, or you neglect me, or I feel like I'm second, or this is just one more illustration of how you don't care about me the way I need to be cared for. There are so many things behind that thing. And I love, have you seen the movie The Breakup with Vince Vaughn and Jennifer Aniston?
I can remember one scene, but yes, I've seen it.
There's a great scene at the beginning. They have this whole thing about throwing a dinner party, and the dinner is done, and Jennifer Aniston, she comes out and she asks Vince Vaughn to like help her do the dishes, and he's playing Grand Theft Auto 3 and he doesn't want to help do the dishes. And so he's like, yeah, I'll get to it in a minute. And she's like, I went through all this trouble to like throw this party for all of our friends. And he says, fine, I'll do it in just a minute. And she says, you know what, forget it. And he takes his controller and he throws it down on the ground and he says, fine, I'll help you do the dishes. He uses a swear word that I can't use in the podcast, but then she says, you know what, forget it. And he's like, I thought you wanted me to do dishes. And she says, I want you to want to do dishes. To which he responds, why would I want to do dishes? And then they break up.
Yeah.
And the dishes, that's the thing.
Yep.
But behind the thing is so much more.
Yes.
And whether it's the dishes or the popcorn or whatever it is, there's always a thing behind the thing. And that's actually what sends us into that downstairs brain.
Yeah. And when they're not resolved, Josh, they pile up. And all of them start creating narratives and stories that we start to think about how our marriage is doing, and stories that we start to impose on our spouse we actually start to look for it. Yeah. And there's a saying there, the story you tell yourself is the story you'll live. That's also true for marriage. What you think about and say about yourself or how your spouse views you and how healthy your marriage is, you're actually going to look for it. And so even subconsciously, that spouse might have been looking for, yep, see, there it is again. My spouse doesn't listen to me. And it's really an important distinction, Josh, I think, as you're building a thriving marriage, is that you are going to have very real emotions triggered by popcorn, whatever that is. And your brain is going to need context, and you're going to immediately share a story in your head about your spouse that may or may not be true, and about the state of your marriage that may or may not be true.
Totally.
And healthy communication is being able to name the things behind whatever the popcorn is or whatever your marriage currently is kind of going through, and to actually invite your spouse to tell the story of what they feel about you, what they see in you, because chances are whatever spouse brought the butter on the popcorn looking forward to an evening of quality time did not get up that morning and say, okay, God, would you help me make my spouse feel unheard and devalued? That's what I want to do today. Yep. Got it. Butter.
Yeah.
I can. Yep. That's not most of our, no matter the story that someone comes into my counseling office, the fact that they're there, there's hope.
Right.
They don't wake up. They don't think, how do I destroy this marriage? They're just saying, we don't know how to do this marriage right.
Right.
And over time, there's just this negative story that they put on their spouse or tell themselves that actually may or may not be true. But because the emotion that's triggered is so real, because they can feel it in their body, they just attach that context to it. And so it feels like it is the true story, if that makes sense, Josh.
That totally makes sense. And I think we can take that one step further, because we talked about this a little bit on the podcast. So those listening, if you recall things like trauma, you recall things like the stress responses, your brain recognizes those responses, and it's learned to basically hunt for them for your own protection. So every time, sticking with the metaphor of the popcorn, every time you hear popcorn popping, your brain is getting ready to switch to your downstairs brain. In fact, I've worked with couples before where, Dave, certain words, phrases, and looks immediately send them into their downstairs brain, whether it is a statement that their spouse makes, or it is in fact one of the, the eye rolls or the looks, or it's like a tapping of their finger on their knee. our brains are trained to hunt for these cues that is essentially telling us, hey, it's about to get bad here. It's about to get bad. And so you need to prepare yourself. And I'm going to prepare you by switching into your downstairs brain so you can react.
Yeah.
Which honestly, if like a bear walked in here, that'd be really good for us to react because we need to like survive. But in our marriage, when we go into that survival mode, or as one author puts it, Chris Corsi, enemy mode, we start to see our spouse as a threat. And then this communication that we have is basically for our survival. And so now we need to fight. And every time you enter into a communication, conversation thing with your spouse and you want to fight and you need to win, you lose.
Absolutely. And like you said, a bear or a house fire or our kids being in danger, so glad that God gave us in his goodness a fight or flight stress response system. Doing dishes on a random Tuesday with our spouse, totally unhelpful. And yeah, we're looking for and hunting, as you put it, for safety and security, to be seen, to be soothed by the person next to us. All those things invite us back upstairs. And it takes a lot of intentionality, Josh, to be able to recognize, right? And the first step trying to help couples recognize without it feeling like a critique. Hey, I think me or both of us are in our fight or flight brain.
Yeah. I don't think this is downstairs.
Working out. And there's a lot of different names with whether it's the 4 horsemen or 4 communication killers. It kills communication. Yeah. And you have to be humble enough as you're just hearing this and recognizing some of these patterns, maybe even in your own marriage story, to say one or both of us have to agree. Let's not talk about whatever the thing is or the things behind that while we're in downstairs mode.
Right. We're going to take a time out. We're going to take a break. And we will touch on that in our conversation about conflict resolution, because some of those things go hand in hand. But I do want to say, because you and we've talked about this before, I share this with couples a lot. Even when we're in our upstairs brain, even when communication is good, even when we feel like this is healthy, what we think, what we say, what people hear, and what people understand are not the same thing. There are internal processors and there are verbal processors. And so sometimes, for me, I'm an internal processor. I don't say anything until I'm really sure that what I thought is what's going to come out of my mouth. My wife is a verbal processor, which means she figures out what she's saying as or after she said it. And that means that she's probably going to go through 3 or 4 rounds where it didn't come out great. And then I have to like take time to listen, so I'm not reacting. And the flip side is sometimes when I say things, they're really strong and they're really pointed, and then they almost feel weaponized. And so there's a tempering that has to come when we talk to each other, because what we're thinking and then what we say, man, those are not the same. And then even if the other person is in their upstairs brain, what they hear minus the distraction or whatever, and then what they understand or how they interpret that, we have no control over that. So even taking the time to get clarity of like, hey, this is what I said. How did you hear that? Let's unpack that. That just takes a lot of time. And if you're in your downstairs brain, man, you can bet that it is probably not heard or understood the way that you thought or wanted.
Yes. And when I sit with couples through these realities, I tell them that this is the healthiest way to talk. It doesn't feel the most efficient. And we want to, amidst our busyness, amidst raising kids, our job stress, our hobbies, whatever that is, the last thing we want to do is like slow down to talk, but we have to.
Yes. So there is a difference between, I'm so glad you brought this up, a difference between efficiency and efficacy. There's a difference between efficient communication and effective communication. In the military, they actually say that slow is smooth and smooth is fast. It's actually written up on my whiteboard there as a kind of like a permanent thing. Like I never erase that because I come back to it all the time.
Yeah.
Slow is smooth and smooth is fast. Because when you go slow and it's smooth, you're not going to make mistakes. When you start to speed things up and all you want to do is go fast, guess what? You're going to have problems. And so it's so important that we take the time to slow down and recognize these communication killers, especially when we are dealing with things that are behind the thing that we're arguing about or that we're frustrated by, so that we have a chance to unpack them. So what are some helpful, as we wrap up here for this first session, Dave, what are some helpful items for couples to remember as they're listening to this?
Yeah, I think it's vital to understand that process that you just said of the reality that what is thought and then said is heard by another person and understood sometimes in a completely different way. Have you ever said, wrapped back around something and your spouse is like, well, you said this. You're like, whoa, I never said that.
Never said that.
And then you think about it and then you're like, okay, well, that's not what I meant. And then the spouse says, well, your face sure meant it, right? So we have all of these contexts of understanding.
Right.
All of these old wounds that could have been from childhood, adolescence, and previous conversations within the marriage.
Right.
And so instead of the 4 communication killers, they make it about your spouse.
Yep.
And it's really important to slow down and make it about what's your experience within this conversation.
Yeah.
You have to be able to recognize, oh, I feel that thing again when I see the butter.
Yep.
I need to communicate. Hey, when you put butter on the popcorn, it makes me feel and experience that you don't hear me or you don't value me. And then upstairs conversation, there's an invitation for the other spouse to share their starting point or their heart. It's essentially this concept of giving your spouse the benefit of the doubt.
Benefit of the doubt.
To say, this is what I'm experiencing, not being heard, being devalued.
Yeah.
Can you help me understand what was going on? What was your starting point today or even making the popcorn? Because it sure does feel like you're devaluing me or by not listening or hearing me over these years. And the other spouse then, which we'll get into in conflict resolution, it's kind of two sides to the same coin.
Totally.
To be able to validate that and empathetically and active listen to their spouse and say, wow, like, I'm so sorry I've made you feel like experience this.
Yeah.
To own it,
yeah.
To validate that feeling. And then to affirm, especially if it's true, and most spouses can do this, affirm the other reality. I want to be a spouse that hears you, that values you, and puts your opinion on things first, and to essentially hold the things behind whatever the popcorn brought up, right? And that's an intentional conversation.
Totally. And I think for couples, if you're listening and you're like, hey, how do we work through this? Let me give you a couple of pro tips on this. The first is you may not want to start by doing this verbally because you're probably in patterns of bad communication. And when you say things, it triggers your spouse. It might be more helpful to write it down, maybe through a notebook that you share or a journal that you share, or even just a sheet of paper, maybe text, but be careful with texting because it's hard to read intention in a text message. Yeah. But finding a way to say, dear, when you put butter on the popcorn, I don't feel loved or valued. I don't feel like you care about me. And then letting them have it and giving them some space to think through it, read it, ask questions. And again, all of this is written sometimes just by changing the medium we change the message. And so writing it down can be a powerful way to do that. But however you do to be able to work through that, that's actually a really great way of saying, you know what? I'm sorry. I want to do better next time. And here are some things that I'm taking away from this. And again, we'll talk about conflict resolution coming up in subsequent episodes. But for today, I think just remembering those killers of communication and finding the space to name that thing behind the thing and how that impacts you is a great place to start. In our next episode, we're gonna talk through some ways that you can approach communication. It may feel a little mechanical, but it's actually really helpful. Yep. And we'll have some worksheets to go along with that for you as well. The other element that we're going to touch on, and this is critical, is as we lean into conflict resolution, we're going to start talking about things like taking a timeout and what that looks like. So join us as we continue on. If this has been a helpful conversation for you, we'd love for you to reach out. You can send us an email to chaplaincy@fearlessfollower.org or go to our website, fearlesschaplaincy.org. We'll have connection points for Dave in the podcast notes as well. And if you want to get a hold of him, just feel free to send us a note. We would love to do that with you. Dave, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, it's awesome to be here as always, Josh. Love what you're doing.
And as we continue on, if you want to learn more about the marriage work that Dave and I do together, maybe you have an organization where you'd like us to come in and talk about communication, or maybe you are at a different church and you'd like to put on a marriage workshop or something like that, we'd love to join you in that. So just send us a note. We're excited to continue on this conversation about thriving marriages, and we will talk with you later.